Welcome to the Becoming Whole podcast, where we help men, women, and families learn and live God's good, holy, and beautiful design for sexuality. I'm your host, Josh Glazer, and we're glad you're here. You ready? Let's dive in. Today, we're going to talk about fantasies, sexual fantasies. I don't mean that I'm going to give you sexual fantasies to think about, but I'm going to talk to you about sexual fantasies because so many of you are wrestling with sexual fantasy. A couple things about them. First of all, I think many of us do not take sexual fantasies seriously enough. And I mean that in two ways. First is that a lot of us who have wrestled with unwanted sexual behaviors tend to think about fantasy as kind of the light end of things, not very serious. You don't need to think too much about it. You don't need to worry too much about those. Much better to fantasize than to look at porn and get online or to hook up with somebody or whatever else. The truth is, though, that sexual fantasy actually is the gateway that leads to everything else. You don't typically get online and go looking for porn before you have begun to fantasize. You don't typically hook up with another person before you've begun to imagine yourself hooking up with another person. Sexual fantasy typically precedes any other type of sexual acting out. And that means that we should take very seriously when we are beginning to go down the road of sexual fantasy. And instead of viewing it as just a light, no big deal kind of thing, recognize that it is consistently a part of the bigger deal things, quote unquote, the bigger deal things that you have been pursuing. When I began to take that seriously in my life, it actually began to change significantly everything else, because I was recognizing much earlier on that I was being tempted and that I was beginning to move down the road of those old patterns. And by addressing fantasy and dealing with that, then it actually began to change other behaviors that were further down the road. So I want to encourage you to take fantasy seriously in that way. But secondly, and what I want to talk about for most of this podcast, is the fact that we've got to take fantasy seriously when it comes to being connected to the larger issues that we're really needing to deal with if we want to overcome sexual sin in our life and if we want to become people of sexual integrity. What do I mean by that? Well, Jay Stringer, who is a researcher and an author, he did some research several years ago now of 3,600 men and women who are wrestling with unwanted sexual behaviors. And it was a wonderful research journey, but his research revealed that there were connections between what people were experiencing in their lives or had experienced in their lives and the kind of sexual arousal that they were experiencing. In other words, he was asking the question, out of all the things that you could be pursuing sexually, out of all the things, all the different kinds of scenarios or themes of pornography that you might be looking at, out of all the different themes and ideas and scenarios that you could be fantasizing about, why are you fantasizing about this scenario? Why are you looking for that kind of pornography? And what his research showed was that there are common threads for people in the kinds of pornography they view and the kinds of things they're experiencing or have experienced in their lives. There are common threads between the kind of arousal template a person experiences and the kinds of things that they've experienced either presently or in the past in their lives. For example, one of the strongest correlates that he ran across in regards to men was that men who experienced a sense of meaninglessness in their lives, a lack of meaning in their lives, were 7 times more likely to increase their pornography use. What does all this mean? Well, it means that if we are serious about becoming people of sexual integrity, if we are serious about leaving sexual sin in the past, then there are actually deeper issues, deeper matters of the heart, deeper relational patterns, deeper emotional issues that we've got to address in order to leave them behind, because our fantasies, the kinds of porn we're pursuing, the kind of sexual behavior we're pursuing, is actually looking for something that's not there. So let me give you one example, and then I want to talk to you really quickly about some ideas, some thoughts about how you might begin to pursue understanding your fantasies better. Alex was a man who, whenever he would look at pornography, was typically looking at pornography of a man dominating another man, sexually dominating another man. When he would fantasize, he would typically fantasize about being sexually dominated by another man who was in control or who was forcing him to do something, and then eventually he would enjoy it. This was a common theme for him in his fantasy and pornography use. And he always felt incredibly ashamed by it. He felt like, what is wrong with me that this is what I want to pursue. He didn't share with others, even when others were holding each other accountable around him, other Christian brothers, and they were confessing fantasy, they were confessing pornography. Alex was glad that no one ever asked him for the details about it. He could confess, yeah, hold me accountable because I don't want to look at porn anymore. I don't want to fantasize anymore. But he didn't want to share the deeper story of like what he was actually fantasizing about or what kind of pornography he was actually looking at because he felt so ashamed and embarrassed by it. And for him, to try to resist that pornography and fantasy meant just to try to put it out of his mind. But what he really needed to do was to pay closer attention to and to be curious about why was he drawn to that kind of pornography? What was going on under the surface? Hey friends, if you have something we should be talking about on the show, let us know. Send us an email at podcast@regenerationministries.org. In the meantime, please be sure to review, rate, subscribe, and share this podcast. Now back to the show. One of the things that happened for Alex as he began getting some help with this was he began remembering and recalling that his relationship with his father was always disappointing because his father had chronic depression. And so he was relatively uninvolved in Alex's life. And he never disciplined, never brought any structure, never brought any discipline, never brought any real guidance to Alex. Alex remembers as a little boy being drawn to firefighters and police officers, men that he would describe at that point or that he viewed at that point as manly men, because he just admired their strength, their courage, their willingness to be decisive and to move into trouble and to make something happen in those moments. And for many, many years, Alex thought that attraction, that kind of magnetic pull towards firefighters and police officers was actually just evidence of the inborn nature of his sexual arousal, of his sexual desires, of his sexuality. But as he began to unpack and get help in unpacking, why am I drawn to this kind of fantasy? Why am I returning to this kind of pornography? He began connecting the dots between his experience with his dad, or his lack of his experience with his dad, and what he was looking for. He began recognizing this thread between, I'm looking for someone who can dominate me, and connecting the dots between that and a dad who never disciplined him, who, and he phrased it this way at one point, something to the effect of, I recognize my dad had depression, but it just sucks that he didn't care enough to even want me to do better in my life. So even as a little boy, kind of longing for, and this is maybe something that a lot of little boys might be like, man, I wish my dad never disciplined me. But for Alex, there was a longing for some type of structure, for some type of initiative on his dad's part to want something more for Alex than what Alex was experiencing in himself as a little boy. And that got sexualized and became this. Well, at first it became just kind of this longing for strong men of action in his life, and eventually got sexualized to wanting to be dominated. Well, what does this do? Well, for Alex, it turned some lights on, connected some dots. And so suddenly this thing went from like just evidence about how shameful and awful his sexuality was to, I'm just a guy who longed for a dad to want more for him and to be willing to take action on his behalf. Now, does this mean every kid who has a dad who's not involved, who won't bring structure and discipline, is going to end up having that kind of fantasy? Absolutely not. That's Alex's story. Doesn't mean it's going to be everybody's story. And so even with the research that Jay Stringer did, that he writes about in his book Unwanted, although statistically significant, the correlations, it doesn't mean that it applies to everybody in the exact same way. So there's an art to this. There's nuance to this. And those kinds of things need to be taken into consideration too, as you're seeking to unpack your story. So let's shift gears then and talk about where can you start in connecting the dots in some of your own fantasy life. So I'm going to offer just 4 quick ideas. You ready? Number 1, find someone to walk with you. You're going to need others around you to help with this. Oftentimes what we grow up with that's normal for us is not healthy, and it's hard for us to discern between the two. Alex needed help. You'll need help most likely along the way as well. Secondly, you got to approach this with kindness. Jay Stringer uses these 2 words, and I love them. And I think they've been hallmarks of the way that Regeneration has treated people long before I got here. But to treat yourself with kindness and curiosity, to journey this journey with kindness and curiosity. I love those two words because they're so innocent and so good. We need to be kind to ourselves in this journey, and we need to be curious. Now, curiosity just means like asking those questions, like what's going on here, without condemnation, without any judgment. Let me just seek to understand. I'm not going to seek to judge what I'm feeling. I'm not going to seek to judge what I'm pursuing at this moment. I'm not going to seek to look down on myself or say it's better or worse than somebody else. I'm just going to be curious about it. And then third, be sober about it. And this goes back to what I talked about at the top of the podcast. We have to recognize that if we've been going down this path of fantasy and pornography or whatever the other sexual behaviors have been for years and years and years, then we have created neural pathways in our brain that we're very much accustomed to. And so your body and your brain are going to move in a certain direction. It's going to be very easy for them to move in that direction. And so in order to be sober about this, if you've got some time of sobriety, 30, 60, 90 days of sobriety from sexually acting out, that's probably a really good place to then begin to do some of this fantasy work. If you don't, then seek to get there. Seek to have some distance between you and your acting out, especially if your sexually acting out behaviors are high risk, dangerous behaviors, or put your marriage or other things at risk. You want to make sure to get some sobriety before you start this work. And if they're not as high risk, then at least create some space for yourself by putting some practical, concrete boundaries in place, so that as you begin to do some of this fantasy work, if your brain just tries to rush and move you towards pornography, for example, you've got some filters set on your devices, and so you won't be able to access the pornography. Things like that, just to be really concrete. Hey, listen, I would be remiss if I didn't say here that Regeneration specializes in this kind of stuff, and so if you need help along this journey, we're here for you. If you need some sobriety and some space and some boundaries to help you begin this kind of journey, we're here for you. If you need help connecting the dots, if you're aware of your history and your story, we can walk you through that. That's what our coaches are trained and love to do. So, and we love to do it primarily because we really want to help remove the things in your life that keep you from living as the men and women you're designed to live by God. And so often these things can also just end up subtly getting in the way of our own relationships with God, where we tend to project onto him things that, like Alex did with his dad, and think that God is despondent and distant. So we love getting after these things because we love seeing people grow closer to Jesus, even as they're trying to walk away from some things that they're trying to walk away from. So bless you, brothers and sisters. I hope that's helpful. I know it's a quick flyby, but don't let the quickness of this podcast make you believe that this is a simple or quick process. It's a good, worthwhile process to dive into with care, with kindness, with sobriety, and with the help you need. God bless you.
Thanks for listening in. If you find the content of this podcast helpful, make sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps other people find the show. And if you'd like to check out more resources to help you in your journey towards becoming more whole, go to regenerationministries.org. Again, I'm Josh Glazer, and we'll see you next time.